Every day, we have the ability and opportunity to create a more accepting world by actively coming together and living inclusively. Even small acts of inclusion can have a big impact on making others feel loved and accepted. We here at Kink Candid are different for a number of reasons. Our lifestyle, we have disabilities, and all those sorts of things. And being included is hugely important, and we're acutely aware of that here. Bias and discrimination are some of the most pressing issues facing this country today. While the vast majority of Americans do consider themselves unprejudiced, many of us unintentionally do make snap judgments about people based on what we see: race, age, gender, religion, sexuality, ability. Because most people don't see themselves as part of the problem, they don't recognize that they can be part of the solution. Before anything else, we are all human. So, in order to kind of be part of that solution, let's talk about some examples, talk about some ideas, start a conversation, create deeper connections. Consider those whose voices are and are not represented in your day-to-day life, in any situation you find yourself in. Use inclusive, appropriate, respectful language. We try to pay close attention to that here on the show. Incorporate diverse perspectives into your conversations. Ask yourself, do you avoid people of racial or religious groups on the street? Ask yourself if you've ever found yourself staring at people with disabilities or looking away and making them feel invisible. Consider your own actions and reactions. Learn how you can come together at lovehasnolabels.com. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Hello out there. Welcome to another episode of Kink Candid. Shay here, along with Jay. And today we have an interesting episode. Our regular listeners will remember that a few weeks ago we talked on the topic of the styles of dominance, different methods, so to speak, by which a dominant might display or engage in this lifestyle.
Yeah.
And it was a good episode, I thought, if I do say so myself. However, today I want to delve into, and Munchkin and I talked about this early in the show, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the different types of submissives. Mm-hmm. We are a wide and varied group.
Flip the coin, as it were.
And kind of go into the different sort of things. And because I think there's a little bit of confusion out there these days about the different terminology that you may hear surrounding the lifestyle. It was recently asked online about the different acronyms and terminology. Is there like a dictionary, essentially, for this? And no, there really isn't, but it can be overwhelming, I think, sometimes for our newbies entering the lifestyle for the first time.
It can be overwhelming for some of us older hats at it, too.
It can be. And the terms sometimes get used interchangeably, and that just contributes to the confusion. So that's the reason I kind of wanted to delve into this a little bit and touch on it so that we are all clear with our listeners, at least the way that we here at Kink Candid define these terms.
Right.
So the first thing that I want to talk about is the terminology of a bottom. Now, bottoming initially as a term originated with the gay male scene as far back as the 70s and probably earlier than that, but I know I can't get back that far. But in kink, in the lifestyle, when we refer to a bottom simply means, and I'll let my co-host here, chime in with his thoughts, but when I say a bottom, what I mean personally is someone who has things done to them.
Yeah.
Within
a canvas. They're the
If
canvas.
canvas is a great term. If you are the one being spanked or flogged or electrocuted, as the case may be, or various tied up, what have you, then that's what we mean when we say
Electrified,
bottom.
maybe.
Okay, true. Electrified, not electrocuted, but
We're
but if
kind
you
of
are
hoping to steer away from the electrocution part of things.
true. I am, for example, one of the ways that you could define me, one role that I play is that I am a fire play bottom. And all that means in that context is that I am the one who gets set on fire. I am not the one setting someone on fire. I am the one being set on fire.
Ladies and gentlemen, you learn something new every day.
I like to be set on fire. It's fun.
Well, okay, but that's not something I knew about you until you mentioned it 5 seconds ago. So we're all right.
Fair enough. You'll often hear people say that they are a rope bottom or, what have you, and that just simply means they're the one that likes to be tied up.
Rope bunny is the term that I hear most often where that's concerned.
It is a very common term. And so, like I said, bottom just refers to you are the one receiving the act, so to speak.
Yeah.
And one can be a bottom but not necessarily be submissive.
Right. You may like
in fact,
the
it's quite common.
You may like the experience of having things done to you and still want to sort of have a directing hand in what's being done.
Precisely. And they are sometimes referred to as tower bottoms. That's a common terminology I hear around that. But that's what bottoming simply means, and it's really a lot less complicated than it might seem. Then we get into the submissive, and where I find the most confusion is the delineation between a submissive and a slave.
No.
All slaves are inherently submissive. Not
But
all
not
submissives are slaves.
Not all submissives are cut out to be slaves, no.
They are, in fact, and people, go ahead.
When I hear submissive, most often what I'm dealing with is somebody who, and I'm sure many of our audience will correct me here, but most often what I'm hearing is that this person is a submissive within what we refer to as the bedroom-only crowd. And there's nothing wrong with that. We just prefer they not be confused, and more often than not, the submissives I meet would prefer not to be confused with slaves. One of my closest friends will... No, go right ahead. Your turn.
The point that I draw is that it is possible to be a bedroom-only submissive.
Mm-hmm.
That is a thing that exists. I do not, in my opinion, feel that it is possible to be a bedroom-only slave.
I tend to agree with you there. And again, I'm sure that several of our audience will correct us if we're wrong. I look forward to it. Please do. Educate us. But one of my closest friends will tell you she is a submissive. Her husband will quite eagerly tell her what he wants done and what he's going to do to her in the bedroom. But the minute that bedroom door is open, the minute she steps out into the world, don't you dare give this woman an order. Because she will tell you where to stick it, how far, and how many degrees to twist it.
The other key difference I found in my experience, and as always, I am speaking only of my own experiences and not for the lifestyle as a whole. We are not the Borg. There is no hive mind. But in my experience,
there we go again.
One of the other differences I find is that submissives typically, in my experience, have certain areas of their life that even if they submit outside the bedroom, they often will have certain areas that are open to control by their dominant and certain areas that they absolutely reserve the right to say, no, you don't get control over that.
Right. And that's perfectly valid. Everybody has that right.
Absolutely. Whereas most slaves, in my experience, first of all, we typically are not bedroom-only folk. I don't know that it's possible. And correct me if I'm wrong, audience, but seriously. But in my experience, I don't know how that would work. And so I generally find that slaves tend to be more 24/7. And in general, in my experience, slaves don't, outside of hard limits, of course, because even slaves have hard limits, but outside of that, we don't typically say, you may have control over this, but not that. Not generally.
Right.
And so that's another key difference between a submissive and a slave. And so that I identify much more as a slave and not just as a submissive. I don't identify submissive. I say that, I use that terminology because it's something that people know and are comfortable with, but if within the lifestyle, I identify as a slave. And therefore, so I've seen people tell, especially newbies, that there is no difference, that it's just personal preference which name you use. I vehemently disagree with the statement.
Please stop telling our newbies that. You do them a disservice when you do that.
It's not fair to the newbies who don't necessarily know what they're doing yet. We all had to start somewhere, but there is a difference. And if you go into it thinking it's the same, you're going to run into miscommunications.
Yeah. It's not fair to the newbies, and it's not fair to those of us who've been in the lifestyle and who have chosen our roles and are very clear in that, and to hear ourselves mislabeled.
It tends to be very upsetting to most submissives if you call them a slave, and vice versa. We don't tend to like it. We're a little offended, and so that's an important distinction to draw.
I know a slave who, if you were to refer to them as a submissive, would come after you with a rolling pin because no.
Yeah, it doesn't. We tend to get a little offended. Submissives don't like being called slaves because it implies a level of control they're not prepared to give up, which they are well within their rights to do. And slaves don't like being called submissives because it implies we're keeping a level of control that we don't really want.
Right.
And so it's important to make that distinction. To me, and it's slightly offensive to some, I'm sure, but I have often said that submission is something that you do, whereas for me personally, being a slave is something that I am,
right,
rather than something I do. And so I feel very strongly about that particular distinction. Now, within both categories, and it's important to note here before I go any further that those of us on this side of the slash can, in fact, identify as more than one thing. And I see this asked, can I be an X and a Y? Well, absolutely, as long as you and your partner agree on such a thing, then your dynamic can be whatever you want it to be, and you don't have to define yourself into one role and all other roles are forbidden to you. That's not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination.
It's just as true on this side of the slash too. You can be a master and a sadist. None of them are really mutually exclusive as far as I'm aware.
Then there are categories that you can identify with as either a submissive or a slave. The first that I see come up a lot, and this is where I'm going to warn everyone, including my co-host.
Oh, Lord.
My position on this may be slightly less than appreciated by some, but my opinion is my opinion.
Buckle up, children. Here we go.
let's talk about brats for a moment.
We have to.
It's sort of required. They come up a lot. It's a frequently asked question. So unfortunately, we do have to sort of touch on it. A brat, by definition, is a submissive who pushes the boundaries, who pushes buttons. When I started, brat was most often used to mean playful, slightly sarcastic at various points in time. You might see the bratty submissive stick her tongue out at her dominant.
I know a certain slave who's done that often.
Fair. However, I do find that there is, and that I do still consider to be within the bounds of submission, provided one's dominant is prepared to accept it.
Yeah.
There is a new generation of brats out there who have apparently decided that brat means will not obey unless actively forced into it, essentially.
In my house, we call them snowflakes.
In my house, they are generally not considered welcome for very long.
No, here either.
And that is a category that some choose to identify with. I am told that the bratty submissive, even the bratty submissive who must be made to do things, is still considered to be a submissive. I feel that is a matter of opinion, but
it's an opinion you don't share.
It is not an opinion I share, but because to me,
No.
Submission means voluntarily choosing to submit to another person.
Yeah.
And if you are having to be made to do it, then I don't consider that voluntary, obviously, and therefore it's not an opinion that I share. But that is for other people to decide in their own relationships and dynamics. But suffice it to say that when we refer to a brat, we mean someone who is going to push buttons and push boundaries.
If I have to chase you down and hold you by the hand and make sure that you follow every order, I don't have time for that, nor do I have the patience.
That's generally his opinion too. That's a lot of work, and he's not really interested in doing it. So we don't do the brat thing. In fact, he recently joked that I couldn't if I tried. Like, I don't know how.
That's fair. No, you really don't.
I don't legitimately know how to be like, no, make me. Like, that's not a thing. And so
no.
I don't have a huge amount of experience with them. Now, Munchkin, who has been on the show with me a few times, does have a brat streak. She refers to it in the sense of, for example, she has rules about her, and she's spoken about this on the show, so I'm perfectly within the bounds of reason to bring it up. She has rules about her clothing that she's allowed to wear, clothing that she is not allowed to wear. And she describes her, brat tendencies as putting on the thing that she knows she is not supposed to wear outside the house and then walking very, very slowly in front of him to get the reaction. To get the turn your behind around and go change before I spank you kind of thing. That's what bratting means for her.
I'm sorry, but if what you want is a spanking, why don't you just ask for it?
See, now you sound like mine because he says the same thing. He does,
well,
literally.
Yeah.
He tells me that all the time. He's like, I don't understand this because that is the way that it works at our house. if that is what I am after, and that is something that I feel would be enjoyable or helpful to me in one way or another, I simply say to him, would you mind doing this?
Please, can I have another?
Essentially, yeah. And 9 times out of 10, he will say, yes, absolutely, I will do that later. And then there are times that he's like, no, I can't do that. It will be, no, I can't do that tonight, but remind me tomorrow.
Yeah. I have to work early tomorrow. I'm exhausted. Sleep. Then fun.
Remind me tomorrow. And then, I can do that for you. And so the brat thing is unnecessary at my house, because if I want that kind of reaction, I simply just say, hey, would you mind? And
not just unnecessary, but unwelcome, and from what I understand, fairly impossible. Because if you aren't allowed to wear it outside the house, it doesn't come into the house.
Yes, that is generally the way it works. If it is in my closet, I am allowed to wear it. Which makes me wonder
why people like Munchkin have access to things that they are not allowed to wear. If you don't want them to wear it, put it.
Well, I think in her case, it's more she's allowed to wear these shorts in certain settings, but not others. If we are going to the club, you may wear that short skirt, but if we are going to the grocery store, you may not, sort of thing.
I imagine that's a valid way of managing things. However, it seems like an awful lot of work.
And it's not something that we generally do. If I own the clothing, I'm allowed to wear it. I am expected to wear situationally and weather appropriate clothing, but other than that, he's really not super picky about what I wear.
All right. He expects you to know what situationally and weather appropriate clothing are.
Right.
We've had this discussion before. He expects you to be a functioning human being in and of your own right.
I would not be allowed to, go outside in short shorts and a tank top when it is, 20 degrees, but he also expects you to know that. Like, that's not a thing he has to tell me. And so, that's the brat thing, and they exist. They, I would only caution any of our listeners who are curious about or engaging in or want to engage in a brat style dynamic. Be aware that it is a valid thing that you can do, but it is definitely something that you should be discussing with your dominant before you do it. Because not all doms want a brat, and
no.
And allow me to make a side detour slightly, and then we'll come back to this. But the category
another one.
Yes, small detour.
Okay. Shall I hold up the sign?
Hold up the sign. Detour. Excuse me for just a moment. Hold up a minute. There is a known tendency of late, I've seen it multiple times, of brats online telling other potential brats or aspiring brats, so to speak, that if a dominant does not want to or choose to tolerate that sort of dynamic, then it is because they are not a real dom, not a real man, not strong enough, too weak to handle, et cetera, Allow me to state very quickly, none of this is true.
No, please stop this. Stop this now before someone hurts you.
Not all doms want to deal with threats, and that is perfectly valid on their end.
Yeah.
And just as not all submissives choose to be brats, not all doms want to deal with it. And we don't want to be forced into things that we don't want, and we shouldn't expect them to either. So, that's sort of an important thing.
Detour over? Should I get out the roadmap?
Yes, detour over. Flip side to the brat is the service sub. Most slaves could also be classified as service subs.
Yeah.
Service
You
sub
enjoy-
is
Go ahead.
service.
You're good.
Service subs are service oriented. We want to take enjoyment in being of service to our dominant partners.
Not just enjoyment, but pride.
Yes. In my house, that may look like giving him a massage when he needs it, because his back is hurting. It often looks like when I make dinner, because I am the cook in our house. When I make dinner, I will feed the children because they eat first. And then the next thing that I do is make up a plate of whatever we're having for dinner and bring it to him.
Yeah. These are all fine and dandy, but you're missing one. You're missing one that you and I have talked about repeatedly. Coffee.
Yes, making up the coffee.
You started with the more complicated areas of things and the more, labor-intensive areas of things. Why not start with, tell them about the simpler?
It looks, that is a valid point. That's a very good point. Making coffee for him, or just tonight I got up to get myself something to drink and turned and asked him, do you need a bottle of water? Because I was getting up anyway and I wanted to make sure he had a drink. Those sorts of things. These are all services they offer. If he wants to soak in a tub because he's hurting or needs to relax, I will run him a bath with Epsom salts. These are little things that I do that are service oriented, because that's part of my purpose for myself.
My girl, if she's getting up and going into the kitchen, before I have realized that she's gotten up and have had time to turn around and ask, can I have a soda while you're in there? There's a soda sitting on my desk and she's headed back down the stairs.
We serve in these ways because we are service oriented. It's part of the dynamic. And you will find that it is often referred to among submissives as a service sub. And as I pointed out, I would hazard to guess that most, if not all, slaves could also be classified as service subs.
All of the ones that I know are.
Everyone I've ever known. So I would hazard that it is at least a majority, if not all, would be classified in that same way. We tend to be focused on making our dominant partner's life easier, to sum up. And then there are a few lesser known, or well, not lesser known, but smaller niche categories of submission. You have your pet play, which can look a couple different ways. I do have a kitten side. It is something that we engage in at my house. Pet play can range anything from not being allowed to stand or speak because one is an animal in that moment, to a more human pet. I myself am more of a human pet. I stand, I talk, I use my hands, I do all the things that a human would do. I'm also possibly wearing ears and a tail and cuddling. But there's a wide range, and puppies, kittens, bunnies are the most common, but they're also fox, cow, you name it. And so that's another subset of submissives.
I have a close friend who readily identifies himself as a fox in daily life. It's part of who he is. So there you are.
This is sometimes semi-related to the furries, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
Depending on how it manifests in someone's life.
And
I've
is.
seen everything.
I'm sorry. My friend is a fox in the furry community, but he's also a fox in his kink as well. He's a fox within his relationship. It's just how he identifies.
And so, and I've seen everything from people who identify 100% of the time as their animal, to those who it's purely sexual, to those it's somewhere in between. And like I said, it's got a wide sort of range that can be encompassed by it. Many, though not most, and certainly not all, pets are often also littles. Now, the littles are a whole other category in and of themselves. Little refers specifically to those who either regress to or essentially role play as a child. This is not to be confused with pedophilia. They are in fact adults.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Those who choose to age regress, and by age regress I mean they are mentally that child's age at that moment, that is generally a non-sexual state for most of the ones I've encountered. It's not a sexual kink per se. It is usually trauma related in my experience. Littles tend to be anybody under whose role play or regression age is under about 10 or 12 years old. Most often toddlers and early elementary school age. 3 to 5 is the most common that I've encountered. Subset of the littles are the adult babies, who are in fact adults who, for various reasons, wish to be a baby at various points in time. And this can go all the way up to and including things like cribs and diapers, depending on the needs of the baby in question. This is usually less about trauma and more about just the need to be nurtured.
Yeah.
They're looking for a certain type of nurturing care that comes with that. Smaller subset of that group are your middle. Middle typically means teenager.
Yeah.
Anywhere between about 13, 14 years old and up to about 17 or so.
And I feel the need to make it clear, we're not talking about people who are legally a teenager. We're not talking about, children here. We're talking about perfectly legal adults who, for whatever reason, feel the need to regress to that teenage state of mind.
And it is often, there are many reasons this might be. The most common one that I've heard personally is that there was, for one reason or another, they were not able to experience that stage of life in the typical way. Everything from I got kicked out of my house and I was homeless at 15, to I had to grow up and take care of a family member, to I recently saw one refer to the fact that they are transgender, and as a trans woman did not get to be a teenage girl.
That's fair. That makes sense.
And wanted to kind of go back and get to be a teenage girl now, which makes a lot of sense when I thought about it. I was like, actually, you know what? That totally makes sense to me. And so they, as an adult, are going, you know what? I want to experience being a teenage girl. I want to experience all the teenage girl things, the teenage girl clothing and music and all those things that I didn't get to experience. And so now that I'm an adult, I am choosing to reclaim that stage of life. Littles are often, though not always, abuse survivors.
Yeah.
And they are reclaiming their childhood in a safe environment. It's probably the most misunderstood and looked down upon kink in my experience. It's typically seen as pedophilic, and it's really not, because we are talking about actual adults and those that engage in legitimate age regression to childhood states where they are regressing to age 3 or age 4 or what have you. That is most often not a sexual state for them.
No.
Because they're 3 years old at that moment, mentally. Their body may be an adult, but at that moment their brain is not. And so that is not a sexual state for them typically. And so it's a little bit misunderstood, but it has its place. Related to that are, and this is a term that I want to touch on, and you and I are going to discuss this a little bit because it is the most misunderstood and misused term in my experience, is the baby girl submissive.
Okay. Yeah.
Baby girls are not littles per se.
No. Closer related, I would say, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm stepping out of line here, but closer related to your middles, if anything at all.
If anything, yes, I would tend to agree. The key thing to understand about the baby girl style is that baby girls don't have a regression age.
No.
They are not mentally 5, nor are they mentally 12 either. They are still mentally their chronological age. They are simply choosing to engage in the playful, silly,
less mature
side of themselves.
Yeah.
And they like to engage in that. They want to indulge that side of their personality. And I've known a couple, and neither one of them had a little age. And so they would go, I'm not a little. I don't have a little age. I'm not regressing to age 6. I simply want to color. Munchkin will tell you that she is more of a baby girl. She doesn't have a little age. She doesn't want a pacifier or a sippy cup. She doesn't regress to, 5 years old or what have you. She simply wants to play with stickers and color because she finds those things fun.
Mm-hmm.
And that is more what we would call a baby girl.
Yeah.
It's its own thing. You can often, though not by any stretch of the imagination always, tell what style of submissive you are dealing with by what they choose to call their dominant partners. This is not 100% foolproof, but it is common.
Yeah.
You will rarely hear in private a slave refer to her dominant partner as sir.
Or daddy.
Right. We may use these terms we may use sir in public because it is more socially acceptable. And the same is true. You will not often hear, say, a little or a brat or a submissive in general refer to their dominant partner as master. That is typically a term that you will hear from slaves. And so if you're hearing master, the chances are good you are dealing with a slave.
Yeah.
If you are hearing sir, chances are good you are dealing with a submissive. If you don't hear any title, you may be dealing with a bottom. If you hear daddy, it gets a little complicated.
Little.
Littles, middles, many pets, though not all, and baby girls will all frequently use daddy. So chances are good that they identify in one of those categories, but knowing which one is slightly more complicated in my experience.
When in doubt, ask.
Exactly that. If you're not sure, simply ask. The vast majority of us in the lifestyle are fairly open. I mean, at least with other kinky people, and we'll happily tell you exactly how we identify and what it is that where we fit. But as I said earlier, don't be surprised if you ask someone where they fit in it and they tell you that they are a little and a slave, or a brat and a submissive, or a baby girl and a puppy. There's any number of permutations, and you are not restricted to being only one thing.
No.
That is something that it took me a long time to realize myself, but it's important to pass that along to especially our newer to the lifestyle listeners, that don't feel like you have to check all the boxes and in one category and only be that category. That's by no means a requirement.
Also, don't feel like you have to check all the boxes all at once. Your lifestyle, because we as humans change, your lifestyle changes. Your tastes change. The things that you need will change, and therefore your kink has to change with them.
That's an incredibly important point that a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily realize. I've counseled people recently about that, because I've come to understand that a lot over the last few years, that your dynamic can and probably will change over time.
Mm-hmm.
As you both learn more things about yourselves and kind of figure out where you fit. Where you fit today is not necessarily where you're going to be who you will be in 5 years, and that's not a bad thing. The other thing I do want to counsel, though, on that, and this is where I will head us into our wrap up a little bit, I think, but this is something that's been kind of picking at me a little bit when we talk about the categories of submission. We talked about the categories of dominance too. I see a common understanding that if one wishes to be a slave, one must be a submissive first before transitioning and graduating into slavery.
No.
I see that a lot. I've been asked that myself. Oh, you're a slave. Well, how long did you spend as a sub before you transitioned into it? I'm going, what? No, I didn't.
No. You were a slave from the day I met you.
I've always been that. That's who I am. And so, don't think that if you feel that you identify with the slave role, don't think you are required by any rule to be a sub for so long before you're allowed to be a slave, that you have to be a sub to your dominant for X amount of time before you transition into a master and slave relationship. It's not required. And on the flip side, if you don't identify with it, it's not a goal. It's not a goalpost.
No.
You haven't failed if you decide I am a sub and I only ever want to be a sub.
You haven't failed. It's not a milestone.
There's not a progression. You don't graduate into another role in the lifestyle. And I think there's this misconception about that.
It's not high school.
No, we don't start out as this and then become this and then become that. No, that's not. And you may start, and let me be clear that if you start out as a submissive and then later discover as you grow that you are more interested in a slave dynamic, that is perfectly valid. Just don't think that you have to graduate to being a slave or that you must have done your time as a submissive before you're allowed to be one.
That makes it sound like punishment, and that puts us in a rather uncomfortable frame of mind.
Yeah, I don't like it. There's nothing wrong with either form. There's nothing wrong with starting as one and becoming another later. There's nothing wrong with starting as one and remaining that way in perpetuity. There's nothing wrong with either arrangement. If you decide today, you know what, I really feel like being a slave is what works for me, don't think that it's not valid because you didn't spend enough time being a sub first. It's the same as the old silly rule that says that if you want to be a dominant, you have to be a sub first, which to me makes absolutely zero sense. I've never understood it. I really haven't, because why? The two are not connected. And not everyone is supposed to be submissive. Just like,
no.
To me, I flipped it on its head to see if I could make it make sense in my head. And I was like, if someone said to me, you can't be a slave because you've never been a master, you have to be a master first. I'm like, that would make no sense. That's not who I am.
No, it's not how you're wired.
And it would not make sense. And it would never, I wouldn't gain anything from it because I'm not wired that way. And so to our new dominants out there listening, please don't let anyone tell you that you have to spend time as a submissive first.
I'm sure that's worked well for some people out there. It's just, I couldn't have done it. And it certainly shouldn't be required by anyone.
If you want to explore and see if that works for you, maybe you want to explore it. Maybe you're not sure where you fit. Maybe you are a switch and you want to explore both sides of the coin. Those are valid things, but you shouldn't feel like you have to be a sub first. It's a very strange attitude to me. Well, I know where it comes from, but it doesn't make any sense. It never made sense to me. It comes from the old leather community.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what their reasoning was behind it, and maybe it works in that setting. I don't know.
I think I may know what the reasoning is. It's a perversion of the saying that you can't use a tool until you've experienced it being used on you. I don't want someone using a flogger or whip on my girl until they know what that sensation is, but it feels like being used on their own skin. Okay? But that doesn't necessarily extend it to you have to be a submissive before you can become you have to spend time as a submissive before you can become a dominant. The two aren't equal. It's taking the one to an absurd extreme, in my opinion.
And that makes sense because I know where that will. I understand why that's a thing, and I see it in practice, even in my own home. Every single time we turn on the violet wand here to engage in that, electricity, before that wand ever touches me, he will have tested it against his arm.
Yeah.
so that he knows what the power level that it is currently set at is going to feel like. And, that's something that we do on a regular basis, because he goes, if I don't know what it's set at and I don't know what that power level feels like, I can't feel confident in using it on you. And that's absolutely valid. You should know what the tools you're using feel like. You should know what they're capable of before you wield it on someone else. But experiencing the sensation that can be caused by a specific tool doesn't equate to being submissive.
No.
And so I think you're right. I think it's just a absurd extension of that rule. So suffice it to say that no, you don't have to be a submissive to be a dominant. No, you don't have to be a submissive to be a slave. No, you don't have to progress from submissive to slave. No one should be pushing these things. They are individual, different things, and you should find the role that fits you the best and go with it. But also know that the role that you fall into today is not necessarily the role you will fall into for the rest of your life. People find their switch side, or they suddenly discover that they have a little side that they didn't know they had, or that they have a brat streak that they were unaware of. All those things can sort of come up, and within the same relationship, you may feel one way with one partner and another way with another partner, but you may feel this one way with a partner today and then feel a different way with that same partner 5 years from now. And so just take that into account when you listen to these roles and say, oh, you know what, that sounds like me. It might today, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will in a few years.
We change, we learn, we grow.
And take the roles and blend them however works for you. Your dynamic, we say this a lot in one of the subreddits that I'm in, is that your dynamic is your dynamic. We get asked a lot, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? The only answer to the question of is this okay is, do you and your partner both consent to and enjoy this? Yes, then it's okay.
Yeah.
It might not be okay for me, but it's okay for you.
Yeah.
So blend your roles into whatever dynamic works for you and go with it. We will be back next week. I don't have a topic lined up that will come up. We will figure that out between now and then.
Yeah.
But we will be back next week.
We'll sit down and snowball it.
Yep, we'll figure it out, and we will be back next week. And look for another soapbox from one of us throughout the week. That most weeks there will be at least one come up. So keep an ear out for that as well. And until then, stay safe and stay kinky.